that note, and once again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alpaslan Özerdem, Dean of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And let me start by extending a warm welcome to you all for this Peace Week event, which will be no doubt great event because we'll be focusing on a really exciting subject, kind of bread and butter subject for most of us, negotiations. And before we start, let me just say a few words about the Peace Week, and I want to introduce our guest in this event, and then and also I want to give you a little bit idea about this whole event and how we want to run it. So since fall 2020, the Carter School has hosted Peace Week. This semi-annual event features a series of workshops, roundtables, and book launches, and sometimes arts and sports events too. And this spring 2025 Peace Week has the overall thematic area of conflict resolution in a changing and uncertain world. We decided this thematic area a while ago. I think we were right that it is rather a changing and uncertain world that we are experiencing right now, and it's been really good start so far. We had amazing events, and this one will be no exception. So we gathered here to talk about this book here, Getting Back to the Table: 5 Steps to Reviving Stalled Negotiations by Dr. Josh Weiss. And Josh is the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He does an amazing job at Harvard, but he is also an alum of the Carter School. That really matters to us. And so, Josh, welcome back home. Although it's online, it's great to be with you in this event and being able to talk about your latest book.
Thank you so much, Alp. It's great to be with you, and it very much feels like coming home to George Mason. It was a great experience for me. I loved being there, and still love the school. So,
thank you. And it's great to hear that because our alumni really matter for us, and for them coming back to us with their wonderful products, books like this, and projects and accomplishments, and what they do, and for us to talk about that, right? This is a great opportunity for a conversation with our community here. So I recognize many names in the audience here. Some of them are students, alumni. We have our partners, and so we are with friends here. And for that, the way that I want to run the book talk is really to have a conversation with you, Josh, and about your work and what's all about, really, what we can learn from this book. And
sure.
but then again, I want to give time for Q&A at the end. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will have half an hour, 45 minutes at the end for your questions. You can drop them in the chat before, but if not, just keep your questions for the last half an hour, and we would love to hear them and make sure that you are part of our conversation. So, Josh, when I read this book, there were like 3 things that really struck me about the book. One, that obviously is focused on failure rather than success of negotiations. It's a kind of an interesting way of looking at the topic. And it's a really great book because it focuses on how to navigate failure in negotiation. It's full of handed tips and ideas, like, how to kind of pick up the pieces and continue with negotiation. So, it's an amazing kind of work for that reason, telling us, to deal with the difficulties of failure. Uh, it's a very easy read, I must say. Like you manage to combine deep scholarship with many examples and the illustrations and with the practice of negotiation. And I think that's really helpful. And the third feature that really struck me about this book is that I think this is a book for everybody, for scholars, students, practitioners, and practitioners in all different sectors. Anybody is doing negotiation in different sectors or levels or in different environments. So, I would really recommend anybody who's in our field to read this book. I think they would enjoy it tremendously. So with that, uh, my first question is really kind of considering this book is about negotiation failures rather than successes, because that's usually what we tend to focus on, right? We want to share how to run successful negotiations. I want to know, what was your main driver here to focus on failure rather than success?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it is a logical question, and I think there were really two drivers. So 4 years ago, I wrote a book called The Book of Real World Negotiations, and that was just sort of successful cases in business and et cetera, international and things along those lines. And I happened to be talking to a woman at a conference, and she's like, "Oh, I read your book, and it was really, really good. The real world application, the lessons, everything like that. But I have a question for you, which is, why did you write about successes?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, in my own work as a negotiator, I learn a lot more from my failures than I really do from my successes." And I said, "Well, okay." And she said, "Would you ever consider writing a book maybe about that?" And I said, "Let me think about it." And I think that planted the seed. Um, and the next sort of impetus that sort of crept in was that one of my students, so I run a master's program at a smaller university in Western Massachusetts called Bay Path University. And I happened to see her on campus, and she said, "So what are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually working on a book on failure in negotiation and setbacks and things like that." And she said, "Oh, thank God." And I said, "Really? Well, why would you say that?" And she said, "Because," she's like, "Don't get me wrong, I love the program. It's changed me forever, but like, if we don't always succeed, we think there's something really wrong with us because we never read anything in the literature about failure and like what's reasonable when it comes to this." And so I thought, wow, and I said to her, if that's the impression we've given you, then we're actually really doing you a disservice.
Mm,
We have to be realistic about how difficult the negotiation process is. Much of the time, we are dealing with really challenging issues, whether it's at the international level, or domestically. Many of the negotiations that we engage in are very difficult. I was just on with a colleague of mine who's an entrepreneur, and we were talking about the book, and he said 80% of my negotiations fail.
mm, mm,
And in the entrepreneurial world, probably more of that likely. But I thought, well, this is a problem. Let me look and see what's out there in terms of what's written.
mm,
And as you might guess, I didn't find a whole lot. I found an article here and a short thing there, but nothing really that says when you fail, what do you do? Like, how do you not let it be debilitating? How do you make sure to learn the lessons from what happened? And how do you grow from it
mm,
all? Because I think that's the most important part of this is that when we fail, um, the question is, what do we do with it? And, in the book, I talk about the story of Goldilocks and the three bears. And I'm guessing folks may know that story, but basically, this young girl wanders into a cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and is hungry and comes across three bowls of porridge. And one bowl is too hot, one bowl is too cold and one bowl is just right, and there are these bears that come home, etc. But the point is that the too hot bowl of porridge equivalent when it comes to failure is that you don't look at yourself at all. You blame and you rationalize the situation. You blame others, you blame whatever you can to preserve your reputation. And when you do that, you don't learn anything.
mm,
On the flip side, the too cold bowl of porridge is that you beat yourself up, if I can put it that way. You're very hard on yourself, and as a result, you experience a lot of anxiety, right?
mm,
And the notion of going back to the negotiating table becomes terrifying, or at least very concerning in many ways for you. And we don't learn a whole lot that way either. So
mm,
the just right bowl is to say, failure is going to happen. It's part of the negotiation landscape. What do I do with it when it happens? And how do I make sure um, that I really learn from this and become a better negotiator as a result? And, there's a distinction between setbacks and failures that I make, right? And
mm,
a
mm.
setback, and it's interesting because a lot of times people don't want to call what happened in their negotiations failures.
Yeah. We'll come to the setbacks and
Yeah.
challenges. And I think it's really important that, the way you are recognizing that failures are very much part of what we do with negotiation. And then especially those who just started in this field, the
Hmm.
fear that they might have, right? Just the fear of failure, not really kind of appreciating that it is part of the whole diplomacy negotiation, right?
Yeah.
So your book gives them that confidence that actually you can deal with this. This is part of the process, but you can deal with it.
Right.
Let me just take the conversation to kind of like another place before
Uh-huh.
we really going deep in your book. Let's
Yeah.
talk about negotiation. Why negotiation matters in our lives. I mean, like obviously conflict resolution is about negotiation, but do we negotiate only to solve problems, or negotiation is actually much more, central in our lives? It really matters, in other
Yeah.
aspects of like the way we live.
I'm a big believer. I mean, when I did my PhD at Mason, I've always sort of been kind of pragmatic, and within all of the processes that we talk about at Mason, negotiation always felt to me like the most practical and the one that had the least amount of baggage. Like sometimes when you talk about, I remember talking to people about conflict resolution, they're like, I don't have a conflict.
Mm,
But the response is different when you talk about negotiation. Um, so I have a very broad view of negotiation. I think we negotiate all day, every day. So about 10 years ago, I did a series for the BBC called The Negotiator and You, and it was at work, at home, and in the world around us. Uh, and and I talked about how we negotiate at work constantly. We're also negotiating at home. And in fact, at home is where we need to be doing this a lot more and a lot better with our spouses and parents and kids and whatever. And then in the world around us. So I think there's opportunities every day. And I think sometimes when people think about negotiation, they think much more formally.
mm,
Um, but, if you're negotiating with a credit card company, if you're negotiating with a bank, if you're negotiating to buy a house, a car, that's all this process of, for me, a negotiation is when you have an interest or a need, and perhaps the other party doesn't understand it or doesn't see eye to eye with you, then you're negotiating. And
mm,
that's a big part of our day. And so, but I think, I think you use negotiation for three reasons. One, to your point, is to create deals, whatever
mm,
that looks like, right? The other is to resolve conflict. I mean, the principles that I use from a negotiation point of view are the ones that I use that form the foundation of my approach to dealing with conflict. So it's just a different layer and a different level that I might go. So, in a lot of my negotiations, we might not get down to the level of values or needs, but in some we do. I mean, there's no question that a lot of times what's driving people's behavior is at that level. And then the third, I actually think that over the long term, use negotiation to build relationships so that ultimately, in the end, when you do need to work through a problem or a challenge or to try to figure out something, you've laid the foundation. We all know that when we have relationships with people, we can have a different conversation and approach things differently, and people will share information as opposed to being worried about what you'll do with it.
And including that third one, really, I like that because, creating a deal or resolving conflict dispute, that's where we tend to place negotiation as a kind of a significant, means of action. But as you say, when it comes to building relationships, it's all about negotiation, isn't it? Like the negotiation is, in fact, is a tool for the overall well-being, well-being of us and our relations. Like, being able to negotiate effectively. It's not just solving a problem, but actually preventing problems and the kind of generating relationships that can be effective. So, uh, and I think your book, by capturing that, really kind of brings a different dimension to the understanding of negotiation, and the reader kind of starts to recognize that this is not just about conflict resolution book. This is something else, negotiation in a more broader sense. But with that, my next question is about failure
Mm-hmm.
negotiation. So, I mean, let's face it, as human beings, we don't like failures, right? And I don't know whether this is the kind of the way our brains are wired or something. We are not very good with failures. And so when it comes to failure in negotiation, how do
Mm-hmm.
you usually react to it? What are our kind of the normal kind of behavior to failure in negotiation?
So as I said, I think one of the chapters in the book, I really talk about why is it that we're not learning from our
Mm,
failures, and this gets to your point, which is that we've been conditioned to protect our reputation, right?
mm,
At all costs, and understandably so, right? I mean, we have one name in this world, as my grandmother used to say to me, so don't tarnish your reputation, right? But but I think that people are very quick to want to, defend themselves and to make sure that their reputation is not harmed. And one of the things that I learned, I remember I experienced a failure that I share in the book, and I remember I was sort of dwelling on it, and one of my colleagues said, "You know, I don't mean this to sound bad, but when you realize you're not nearly as important as you think you are, and that nobody's really paying attention to your failure except you, you're going to be able to cope with it a lot better." And you know, as a kid, honestly, I was a very average child. Like there was nothing exceptional about me, and as a result, I failed a lot, and it actually helped me to sort of manage life. Like I feel like it's a strength in many ways. Like I have seen a lot of my colleagues and friends who were straight A students and work with me at Harvard and things like that. And the thought of failure terrifies them to the point where they won't do things. I'm like, just try it. What's the worst thing that could happen? And they're like, I'm not going to do that. That's not my mindset. Like, if I don't feel really comfortable, I'm not going to do it. And I will tell you very candidly that I think the things that I've done in my life that I found most interesting and most powerful were the things where I had some knowledge, but not nearly as much as I needed.
mm,
And I was okay if things didn't work out, and that I knew it wouldn't be the end of the world and that I would learn something really useful. I think the other piece of this is that when we don't recognize our failures, we they traumatize us. So one of the first steps in the book is actually to accept that you failed. Because when you don't do that, you simply hold it all in.
mm,
And it's like a blocked up drain where water can't get through because you're unwilling to accept that this happened and things along those lines. So I think it's that, and I think, human beings, if you go back to our hunter-gatherer days, if we failed, right, it probably meant we got eaten. So we had to do whatever we could
right.
to preserve ourselves,
Yeah.
right? And today, in the world we live in, you might say that if you fail, and the social media world might eat you in a different kind of way, but but I think that everyone does this. It happens to all of us. And so the question is, how are you going to just say, all right, I didn't get where I wanted to go. Let me
Mhm.
make sure I understand what happened, and
Mhm.
there are pieces in the book that link back to your weaknesses. And the book actually, in many ways, is turning a mirror on yourself. It's
Mm.
much less about others. And that's often what I say to my students and others that I train, that in negotiation, you really only have control over yourself and what you can do. That's the challenge of negotiation, is that we're not in control of a good part of the process. And so managing uncertainty and having to be adaptable and flexible are core dimensions of this, just like, dealing with a conflict or something like that. So
And when you're talking about negotiation here, you're not talking about from the mediation perspective, right? So you are the party yourself and you are negotiating your own interests. Am I right to understand that's where the book is coming from?
it is really focused there. I mean, it probably does apply to mediators,
Mm.
especially given the success rate, if you will, especially at the international level, where the success rate is pretty low for each
Mm.
process. But I think peace processes are actually a really interesting example of this, because
Mm.
failure is frankly the norm for a very long time
Mm.
before you
Mhm.
ultimately reach some sort of success. Now, some people might say, well, those are setbacks. I would actually
Mm.
say, no, those processes failed, but they left behind something to build on.
Mm.
And I think the best mediators pick up on that and say, okay, what can I learn from these previous processes that's going to help me to advance this closer and closer to the ultimate goal of finding, some agreement and way forward.
So that was actually one of the questions that I jotted down here because, you know, how do you make a distinction between a failure in negotiation and that kind of failure that perhaps is just part of that negotiation, that process,
Yeah.
especially intentional peace processes, like as you point out, diplomats would know that getting no is part of like the process, and it only matters until you get yes, right? So I mean, how do you make that distinction? What is a real failure from your perspective?
So, I mean, for me, the way that, and I define failure in the book as not meeting your objective. So you set out an objective prior to any negotiation. And if you don't meet it, then that's a failure.
Okay.
Um, a setback. So a lot of this has to do with the magnitude of what happens.
Mm.
Right. So in the book, I also talk about like a four sort of
Mm.
magnitude scale that sort of says, magnitude 1 and 2 are setbacks that are very likely to be a pretty easy route back to the table. You can see something clearly, might require a little bit of effort, but you can see that. Magnitude 3 is much more of a significant setback where it's unclear about how you might get back to the table, given the circumstances and things like that. It may happen, but dynamics and circumstances might need to change. The fourth one is really more about failure, where you look at the situation and you say, I really can't see a way back to the table right now. And it may mean that the process is just simply was too badly damaged and it's not going to happen. Or, if a lot of time passes and a lot of things go right, there may be some way back, but it's going to take quite a bit of thinking. So the thing is, it's interesting when I was doing the research and doing interviews with negotiators and other colleagues, one of the things that I kept hearing was, you know, I really think about this more as a setback. And
Mm.
in some ways, that's fine. But I think that when we fail, we need to call it that.
Mm.
And there are times when we do call it that, and because in some way there is a bit of a finality to it. It's like there's some negotiations, and I share some examples in the book where things have just been damaged so badly that there's no chance.
Mm.
I do work with a lot of different companies through my training and consulting work. And there's one company, an engineering firm, who did a project in the early 1970s, and it went so badly. There was a really bad conflict that happened as a result. This was in Niagara Falls, New York. And that company has never been able to work there again. We're
Mhm.
talking about about the better part of 50 years, right?
Mhm.
55 years. that was a failure. Like there's no setback there. That was a failed process that didn't work, and it destroyed relationships and damaged the way in which people work.
Thank you for that. And I think it's really helpful to, the way your book sort of identifies different types of
Mhm.
failures, like take a crack at it, failure, slipping
Right.
through our fingers, failure. And
Yeah.
I really enjoy the kind of like you do the way you kind of describe each type failure. And
Mm.
with each of them, kind of my experience resonated with these different types of failures. Do you want to say something a little bit more about these different types of failures?
Well, the one thing that I'd like to say, and the reason that I did it was that I was hoping to sort of kind of almost put little red flags next to each one of them so that when you read it and then you go into a negotiation, you can think about,
Hmm.
let me make sure that I don't, fall into that trap
Yeah.
of having, agreeing to something that is worse than my alternative or my BATNA, right? Or reaching a short-term agreement that meets my needs, my financial needs or whatever it might be. But if I damage the relationship in the process, that's a failure, especially, particularly when we are going to have to negotiate with those people into the future, right? So I want people, I think the first part of any learning is awareness. And in a lot of the trainings I do, people say, I do a lot of what you shared with me, but I don't do
Mhm.
it strategically. And there are a lot of pieces of this that I was sort of unaware. I just do it intuitively. And so
Mhm.
I've always felt like the first step is if I can make people aware of that. It's similar to the biases that I talk about in the book. There are so many biases that cloud our thinking and our judgment, and people are unaware of them. And so when you make them aware of that, all of a sudden they're like, oh, um, okay, well, now I need to pay attention to confirmation bias or the backfire effect or whatever it might be. So I think that's the part that I want people, and like I list 7 kinds of failure in there. I'm not claiming that's an exhaustive list. I bet if people read it, they would probably say, I can think of another one, right?
Yeah.
And that's the idea, is to say, what are these different ways we can fail so that I can be sort of looking out for them. And, I one of the things I really, by the way, I loved working with this publisher. They're called Barrett Kohler. And
Mhm.
one of the things they did that was really terrific was when I first submitted my manuscript, they turned around and sent it to 5 CEOs of companies, not negotiation experts, people who negotiate, but could give me feedback. And actually, one of the women who read it gave
Mhm.
feedback of, could you give names to these kinds of failures so they're a little easier to remember,
Mhm.
right? Um, and I loved that, and that's where some of those came from.
And the 7 types of failures you identified the names. Yes, as as I mentioned, they're really interesting, and they kind of like stay with you well after read the book. But one of them kind of struck me, and that is the bad agreement failure.
Uh-huh.
Right. Why do you consider, I mean, there is an agreement, and whether it's bad or not, I mean, it's kind of perhaps a little bit subjective, right? So, why do you consider bad agreement as a failure if the failure is about, I mean, are you saying that after the bad agreement, you still need to pick up the pieces and go back to the negotiation table? Why is this
So,
one of them?
so I'm saying that a bad agreement is a form of failure. And the reason I say that is there's 2 reasons. One is that most people think that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement, and it's not.
Right.
It's about meeting your objective as best as possible. So if you reach an agreement
Hmm.
that is worse than your BATNA or your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which is, often called your walkaway alternative, right? If you reach an agreement that's actually worse than your alternative that you should have done, you should have walked away because it made sense. That to me is not meeting your objective as best as possible. So that's actually a bad agreement. And the world is, to be very frank, the world is littered with bad agreements.
Mm.
In the world of negotiation, when I went back and sort of started reading more and more, the field started saying when it in the 50s and 60s, when it was rooted in economics and things, game theory and things like that, they said the way we judge success is did you reach agreement or not? And
mm,
then in the 70s, behavioral psychologists came along and said, hang on a minute. If you reach an agreement and 3 days later it falls apart because it wasn't a good agreement, was that still success?
mm,
And the economists are like, probably not. We don't think so, right? So the point is that I wanted people to understand, A, the purpose of negotiation is not about reaching agreement. And I can't tell you how many people are like, wait a minute,
mm,
what are you talking about? Like, that's what I thought I was doing
mm,
in a negotiation. And the answer is it's not. It
mm,
it's negotiation is one tool. And
mm,
if you can reach an agreement and it's the best course of action for you to meet your objectives, then do it. But if it's not, then don't. There are a lot of bad agreements out there that don't meet anybody's interests and really should never have um, been agreed to. And actually, this is where I draw a connection to the problem of compromise because too often people think in negotiation that they always have to compromise to find a solution, which means for most people that they have to give up the most important thing in this negotiation in order to reach agreement.
mm,
But, when people say, um, why, when I ask people, why don't you like to negotiate? Because there's a lot of people out there they don't. They say to me, because I always have to give up something really important in order to get to an agreement. I'm like, do you? Because if you do, you're not doing this right. So in the book I wrote 4 years ago, the one about the real world successes, if you read it, there's very little compromise. What there is getting down to the underlying interests of the parties involved and problem solving and thinking differently. That's successful stuff to me. I think compromise is actually a very lazy way to negotiate. And it's an expedient approach, right? If you're under the gun and time pressure is critical in a negotiation, then you may have to compromise. But there are a lot of times where people compromise on their values, they compromise on core beliefs in order to reach agreement. I'm like, you should never do that because you're going to regret it. And look at the history of this country. It was built on really bad compromises. So, that's a core piece of this for me is helping people to realize that there are certain behaviors that people have learned in terms of how to be a good negotiator that are leading them astray. And that's one of them. And I encourage people in the fourth step in the book to think about that.
And what you just said about negotiation is just so thought-provoking, and I think really we need to reflect this the way we teach negotiation and the kind of understanding of the whole process. And ladies and gentlemen, really, I mean, this is an amazing book, and what you are just hearing from Josh is just like a reflection of it. And when you read the book, you get that sort of real sense of nuances as a complete fresh look and focus on negotiation. So let me just now take us to the second phase of our conversation, Josh. Talk
Sure.
about failure and the kind of like problem. So let's get back to the table, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
And with that, I have two questions. The first one of which is that, in the book, you are using the concepts of a growth mindset.
Yeah.
You are also talking about resilient negotiator, and
Right.
you are making an argument around this, like as the, the way forward. You stand up from your failure and then getting back to the table. But can you just tell us a little bit about those two concepts of growth mindset and resilient negotiator and how they are, significant in your conceptualization of getting back to the table?
Yeah, sure. They're really important ideas. So, a growth mindset, for those of you who don't know, there was a woman named Carol Dweck, who was a psychologist at Stanford, who wrote a book about this idea of a growth mindset. And a growth mindset was compared to a fixed mindset is really important. She said basically people who fail have a fixed mindset. They say, for example, I'm not good at this, so I'm not going to try. There's nothing I can do. Like my parents were bad at math, and so I'm going to be bad at math. And there's nothing that's going to change that. That's a fixed mindset. And she says there's no way that you're going to succeed in the world if you have that because you just throw your hands up and say, there's nothing I can do. A growth mindset says, I know I'm not good at math, but I know I can get better with hard work. And I'm going to work at it. I'm going to put in the time and the effort to do that. And, I've been in the world of negotiation now for 30 years, and I still am constantly learning new aspects and new dimensions of this realm and how difficult it is. It's really fundamentally important to say, if I have a weakness in negotiation, how am I going to work on it? How am I going to get better at that aspect of negotiation? Because it won't get better if I simply say, for example, I'm not good at adapting, right? I need to be able to plan everything out. You can't do that in negotiation. And you can't do that in resolving conflicts either, because you're always working with incomplete information. So adaptability is a fundamental aspect of negotiating effectively. And so if you were to say to me, I can't, I'm a planner, I just can't learn to adapt, I'm going to tell you that you're not going to be a very good negotiator. And what I do with my students or the people I train is when somebody says to me, I can't adapt, like for whatever reason, I try to go back and say, well, tell me why. Why is it so hard? Like, where's the struggle so that we can pinpoint that for you and then think about how to come at the problem differently. So a growth mindset is all about is this notion of how do I grow in these places where I struggle and to see it as a challenge. And I think what connects very clearly with that is resiliency. The best negotiators that I've had the pleasure of working with and knowing over the years um, are both resilient and persistent. Um, they will flip a problem 6 different ways until they've figured it out. They will stay at the table. They won't give up. Um, and that's a level of persistence, and it's also a resiliency that you know not everything I do is going to work out, but that doesn't mean that I can't find a solution. One of the people that I work with quite a bit, William Ury, often will say, we haven't found a solution yet. And I'm a big believer that if the parties are really committed and they stay at the table long enough, they're patient, they work the problem, that almost all situations can find a solution. It's when there are these dynamics involved that push us away from that, that there's one side isn't really invested in the process, there's time pressure, whatever it might be. Um, and I think it's interesting when I ask people, did you negotiate? And they'll say, well, yes. And I say, well, what did you do? And they'll say, well, we made an offer to them, whatever it is, and they came back and said that wasn't acceptable, and they made a counter offer, and we were too far apart, and that was the end. And I said, you didn't negotiate. That wasn't negotiating. Yeah, and there was a lot more to do before you threw up your hands and said, I guess we're stuck. So I think I want people to really understand that the growth mindset is the art of the possible, right? And realizing that with hard work, you can overcome things. Um, and again, I realize there are lots of challenges that go along with that. I'm not saying any of this is easy, but it's possible. And I remember teaching my daughters that idea of a growth mindset when I learned about it, and it became really fundamental to their own development. And I wouldn't let them stay in a fixed mindset. I just, sort of refused to do that. But in order to have that kind of growth mindset, you have to be resilient. You have to say, okay, I took this math test and I got a 60, and the next time I took it and I got a 70, and I'm still disappointed, but the next time I'm going to take it, I'm going to get an 80, and I'm going to keep working until I get myself where I want to go.
Wonderful. And the mindset that you are describing uh,
Mm,
is all about the 5 steps that you are recommending in the book, right?
right.
So I want to talk about them next, and I really want to kind of spend the rest of our conversation on them. So
Mm,
those 5 steps, starting with accepting it, analyzing it, learning the right lesson, unlearning weaknesses, and
mm,
turning to the table. So can you give us a summary of
yeah.
each step and how they are interlinked with each other? And and obviously getting to the table, that's the kind of our goal.
Right.
But I assume that this is not just getting to the table in a different mindset and the kind of like way. So tell us,
Yeah.
how this going to change the negotiation.
Yeah, it's getting back to the table in a different way. That's right. And so the first step, what's interesting is that when people fail, like I said, they don't want to accept it. They want to push it aside. It's almost like, when emotions start to play a role in dealing with conflict, people want to suppress it. They want to push them aside and they don't want to recognize them.
Mm,
But that almost always makes things worse, right? So one of the things that I've noticed when people fail is that they just cannot accept it. They come up with all reasons and excuses as to why they didn't fail or what, etc. And there's something honestly kind of liberating about saying, you know what? Yep, I failed. It happened. And so I have a new reality that I'm going to deal with. And in that chapter, I talk about um, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model for dealing with grief. And it's a well-known model. It's been criticized in different ways because she basically talks about the 5 steps, the 5 stages of grief, but not everybody goes through those, all of them. And in the book, I'm very clear that I don't think everybody goes through all of these, but I do think it's a useful framework for somebody to look at and say, what's the process that I'm going to go through when I fail? And so I kind of explain that there are these different steps, and you can think about how you need to make your way through them, but you need to go through them one way or another. And I use the example of a colleague of mine who didn't get a position that she was really hoping to get. And she was really distraught. And, you know, when I started to talk to her and try to help her think about where she would go, it was very clear to me that, she needed to start out because she was in denial. She was like, this can't be happening. This can't be right, etc. And then she moved to sort of anxiety, like, what am I going to do now? I had my heart set on this job. But what's interesting is in the Kubler-Ross model, she should have gone to anger, but she's not that kind of person. She doesn't need anger. What she needed was sadness. She spent days crying because she didn't get this position. And that was the cathartic piece for her to be able to cope with this and then to kind of accept her new reality and to think about where to go from here. So I use that model as a way of trying to help people to think, process this, like take it in and make some sense out of it. And don't push aside the emotional piece of this. Like feel the sting of the loss. Even if it's, a setback, it's still going to be disappointing, right? And when you do that, then you're sort of ready to go to the next step of actually analyzing what happened. And, too often I find people don't analyze what transpired in a negotiation very well, if at all. And in this instance, what I really try to help people to do is look at the big picture, right? Ask yourself, of those 7 failures, which kind did I have, right? And then people always want to know, how bad was it, right? Can I get back to the table? Things like that. But it's not enough to do the big picture thing. What I want people to do, because an important part of getting back to the table is understanding, were there specific instances or interchanges during what are also called critical moments during the negotiation that were pivotal and
mm,
where things really broke down. So I try to encourage people to go back and think about, the place where things started to unravel and to say, what did I do? And what did the other side do? And what what could I have done differently? Or if I can get back to the table, how do I pick up at that point and then move things forward? And I think that kind of an analysis is really helpful to understand how you might get back to the table or how you might learn. Um, if you indeed have a failure and you're not getting back to the table, how can you really learn from that and say, well, if this was the interchange, here's what I might have been able to do differently, right? So that we didn't go down that role and or down that road in a way that ended up causing our failure, if you will, at least in part. Um, Once you've done the analysis, then I ask folks to kind of think about what are the lessons from this particular negotiation for, either coming back to the table or going forward. And to be very frank, part of the reason that I included this is because in a lot of the trainings I do, people will come up to me during the lunch break or after and say, I've got this upcoming negotiation. I'd love if you could spend 15 minutes talking it through with me to help me prepare. And I'll say, sure. And they'll often go back to a negotiation, one where they just succeeded. And they'll say, so I just had this success. And
Mhm.
so I want to use what happened there for this upcoming negotiation. And I will say, well, hang on a minute. Like, are we comparing apples to apples, or are there dynamics that are really different from one negotiation to another that make the lessons that you think you learned not applicable in this next negotiation? Or again, in this particular negotiation, if you're trying to get back to the table, do I really understand what lessons to draw from that? And what I found with that is that too often people really seem to learn the wrong lessons and they try to apply, many people have one approach to negotiation that they use all the time. And that's not helpful. You have to adjust your strategy to the problem that's in front of you. And for me, it comes down to, if it's a one-time negotiation, I use one strategy. If it's a negotiation that's likely to occur and have a long-term kind of impact with a relationship and things like that, I'm going to use a different one. And so I really encourage people to think very, very carefully about what are these lessons that you can learn from your negotiations. And that happens, by the way, at the behavioral level, like around tactics and strategy, but it also happens at a deeper level. And for if there are any people with a background in psychology or things along those lines, there's a concept in psychodynamic theory called transference. And transference is when you've had an experience in the past, it it impacts your future experiences very dramatically, um, without you realizing it. And so if you learned a certain way to negotiate, you're going to bring that approach to every negotiation without really thinking about it. It's a subconscious realm where this occurs. And so I really try to get people to say, um, you know, are you transferring very negative lessons from one negotiation to another that really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense? And, one example I use is that I had a friend who called me one day and he said, "Hey, I've got this colleague who's been negotiating to become part of a firm, and he's gotten three of the four partners to get on board with him becoming this partner." And I said, okay. And he said, and he can't seem to negotiate with this fourth partner as effectively as he did the other three. Would you talk to him and figure out why? And I said, sure. So we're talking and he's telling and the pieces are not adding up. Something doesn't make sense. And I kept saying, I'm still not understanding why you're having a hard time negotiating with this person. You negotiated with these other partners. What's the problem? So he finally said, okay, the problem is that this guy looks and acts just like my first boss, who is the worst human being that I've ever encountered in my entire life. And so as a result, every time I sit down with him, I get, my hands start sweating. It's just miserable. And I can't disassociate the two. And I said, well, you're transferring that experience to another experience that has nothing to do with it. Right. And so it's helping people to sort of pull this apart in a way that sort of gets at why are you doing this, and how can you change? That conveniently leads to this idea, and maybe the idea that I like the most in the book, which is this
And
idea of actively unlearning. So the reason I included this is because the more that I talked to people, the more that I saw that a big part of the reason why they had experienced setbacks or failures was because of their weaknesses. And those weaknesses often translated into kind of older ways of thinking about negotiation, being too reliant on compromise, like we've talked about, or seeing a problem in a win-lose kind of way, or whatever it is. we've learned how to negotiate. Many people have learned, there's lots of people who have not been privy to an education at the Carter School, right? And so they haven't learned what does effective negotiation look like or not look like. Most people, when you ask people, where did you learn negotiation or your perspective on negotiation, most people will say from the media, which is the worst possible place to learn it from. Right. So there's a lot that people can unlearn. Peter Drucker, the management theorist, said, if you want to learn something new, you have to unlearn something old. You have to, recognize that these ideas are out of date and that they're no longer the way that you ought to be doing something. And so what can you replace that with? So for example, when we talk about compromise, and I have a chart in the book where I say, what is it you think might be a weakness? How did you learn it? And what are you going to replace it with? Right? So to me, compromise is a great example of that. Compromise to me is an older concept, a concept that I think lacks creativity. Where you learn that, it's kind of a standard in negotiation, right? But to me, what you should be replacing that with is creative problem solving. Because when you do, you are able to see not only the challenge as a problem, but you get into a creative mode that thinks less about what do I give up and more about there's got to be a way here. There's usually multiple paths to the same end. So how do I find that route, right? So I think there's a lot of fodder for, sort of thinking about what are the things, and I encourage people to think, what are the pillars of your negotiation approach, and why do you think those are the things that are, helping you? And the last step is really this idea of getting back to the table kind of stronger and smarter. So it's taking all these other steps, but it's also saying, there are aspects of negotiation that most people struggle with. And I identify some of them, like we talked about adaptability and the ability to do that. But also, um, one concept that's a core one that I run into all the time is uncertainty. People's mindset is tell me yes or tell me no, but tell me something, right? People genuinely hate uncertainty. As part of the book, I interviewed a woman who wrote a book called Uncertain, a woman named Maggie Jackson, and she talked about how actually uncertain times enable us to come up with the most creative solutions because our neurons are firing in our minds, trying to find a solution. Our brains are wired to find solutions. Again, from back in our hunter-gatherer days, kind of thing. So what I do there is talk a little bit about that, and then I shift and say, finally, if you're going to get back to the table, what do you need to do differently? Something didn't work there, right? If you were trying to be persuasive, but focused your persuasion abilities on logic, well, maybe that wasn't what was going on. Maybe what was going on was really about emotions, and that you've got to try to assuage someone's fears before they're going to come back to the table or whatever's going to resonate with you. And the last thing I'll simply say, and the way that I conclude the book is I talk about the Japanese art of kintsugi. And when I first heard about this, I thought this is perfect because the art of kintsugi is when something breaks, for those of you who don't know, instead of trying to put something back in a way that hides the cracks, the art of kintsugi takes a precious metal and it weaves it so that the cracks are visible. I mean, it's called the art of imperfection for a reason. And it helps people to understand the world isn't perfect. And if you can own your cracks, you're going to be a much better negotiator. I often tell people that if you want to be a good negotiator, you have to be authentic. People often will say, do I fake it till I make it and all? And I'm like, no, because when times get difficult, you are who you are, and that you will become the best negotiator that you can be if you are you and you think, how do I take in and make, create my own approach to negotiation that builds on my strengths and recognize I have weaknesses that I need to be resilient around and to learn how to deal with those and to keep working at them. And so that's the essence of the book. And I really actually advocate to people to wear their failures on their sleeves, like Kintsugi does, to not be afraid of them and not to feel like there's something wrong with you, when you failed because it happens to all of us.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so I think it's a kind of a good time to open the floor for
Sure.
questions. So,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, if you have any question, please put your name in the chat so that I can come to you and call your name for asking your question. So while you are doing that, just I want to kind of with the flow of the conversation, um, then Josh, like even if you've done all the 5 steps, even you've done that unlearning weaknesses, which is, I think, really critical part of um, the whole process, you might
Hmm.
still be failing, right? I mean, I don't think, you know, doing all this will prevent a future failure. I don't think this is not a magical formula to
No.
prevent all failures. Like the way you said, like failure is very much part of life and failure is part of negotiation. So it's kind of something that we need to acknowledge, internalize, and you know, probably the issue here is that whether or not we can make this almost like a second nature, the way we are responding to failure,
Yeah,
right? And
that's right.
so, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how we can actually sort of make it that it just happens as part of our, response.
Well, to me, the purpose of a framework is exactly that. It's to say to folks, like part of the reason I wrote this was because I would talk to people in the field and they would say, I guess I sort of have a way that I try to cope with failure, but it's not written down and it's not, there's nothing accepted out there in terms of a process. And
Mhm.
so for me, when I learn a framework, the goal is, that it eventually it becomes second nature, that I do it over and over again. And so, no, you're right that even when you know this, I mean, there will be ways of avoiding some failures because you become aware of the
Mhm.
possible pitfalls and things like that. But there's sort of a feedback loop. You will fail. And you will fail going forward. And it comes back to the idea of what are you going to do with it? How are you going to really try to learn from it so that it helps you? But no, it's not going to eliminate failure for sure. It's just going to help you to manage it and learn from it as opposed to these other parts, right? These other things that often get in the way and we don't learn.
And with that, let's go to Ines Khalifa. Ines, over to you. You have a question.
Hi Josh, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Ines. How are you?
I am good. I was looking forward, of course, to listening to you. I don't have the book, but I have to get it. I'm just now in
Okay.
Dubai,
Yes, it's
Ah,
and
very
okay.
there's a huge library here. Then I should be finding this very soon. So
Okay.
for me, like the most difficult part in mediation and negotiation is this emotions management.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you say something about it for me and also for the conflict parties?
Yeah, well, first of all, again, I'm a big believer that emotions are a core part of what we do. And I don't, the philosophy here in the United States for a very long time was you have to keep emotions out of all of these processes and remain calm and be very rational. And that's not how human beings work. I mean, it just isn't. So I think we have to embrace emotions. And for me, I mean, it's a question of being able to bring emotions into the process and communicate them without them destroying the process. Right? It's different. If I tell you, look, I'm very frustrated with how things are going. I'm not destroying the process. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm helping you to understand that I'm coming from a place of disappointment. And it's interesting because most human beings are not good at hiding their emotions. But what happens is that we, the other person ends up guessing as to
Mm,
what's going on, right? If I'm negotiating with Alp and I see that he's experiencing some discomfort, having studied body language kind of stuff, I can recognize his facial expressions and things like that, right? I know there's something wrong,
Mhm.
but I don't know what. And so I have to play a guessing game unless Alp can say, look, here's the problem from my point of
Mhm.
view. Um, I think in the book, that chapter about accepting it, I think really does help a lot related to the emotional component. And I think the big challenge is that most people don't manage their emotions well. And so one of the things I've learned is, and I think one of the problems we all have as people in this field is that we like to help people. We like to fix problems. We like to solve problems. And so when someone is experiencing discomfort from an emotional point of view, we want to try to help fix that. And
Mm,
my experience is actually it's much better to not do that. It's actually better to let that person cope with the challenges they have than for me to try to ride in on a white horse and tell them how to figure out what their problems are, so to speak. And what's interesting is that model that I shared, I got to a point where I really start using it, and I watch people when when we're negotiating, I'll watch them, especially when they're upset or angry or whatever. I can kind of watch them go through this curve if you give them the space and the time to do it. And, for me, when people are struggling, you just want to be empathic. You want to say, I'm sure this is difficult for you. I get it, and I don't have a solution. I'm not going to tell you to calm down, which of course is the worst thing to tell people. But I'm
mm,
listening. I think if we can find a way forward, that's going to help with some of the emotional pieces of this. But I think if you haven't studied emotional intelligence, it's not only worthwhile, it's essential to do all
mm.
of this work. I mean, it really is fundamental.
Okay, thank you very much. And what about like making a break or something like this?
Yeah. So I talk about a concept in the negotiation world, actually came from the leadership world originally called going to the balcony. And
Mm,
the balcony is a nice way of just sort of stepping back and taking a break when you can feel like your emotions are overwhelming you. And I'm a big fan of that. And it's funny. The nice thing is actually there are no real rules to negotiation. Um, I was thinking about this a little while ago, and I wrote a little short article on LinkedIn about are there rules to negotiation? And people actually came back and were responding with principles that guide them. And I said, that's actually not what I was interested in. I'm like, are there rules? Like, are there things that you can and cannot do, like a board game? And the answer is actually that there are not. And so, because people would say to me, can you really just step away if you feel, like you might say something or do something that's going to be problematic? I'm like, absolutely. In fact, it's a much better strategy because people who don't step away, there's lots of research in the negotiation world that says that if you, um, it's actually in the heat of the moment where people's emotions are overwhelming them that they make their biggest mistakes in negotiation. So you want to do whatever you can to sort of manage that effectively without denying those emotions.
mm. And do you change your
Uh,
mindset and your
Ines,
approach?
let's make
Yeah.
the last question because there are a couple of other people waiting.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Quantadon Light, I see your hand. Please
Yes,
go ahead.
thank you. Thank you very much. Uh, this was very engaging, and I really appreciate it. I think I enjoyed most most things, but this was the best for me, from my perspective. I have a question. Considering that the American society is multiracial, multi-classes, multi nationalities, multicultures,
Mm,
to me is an incredible laboratory for human development. So
hmm
considering that, how do you then, the natural human emotions that are kind of universal, but they are then expressed under different circumstances in different ways. How do you then determine in negotiating or making agreements for a common goal, let's say, but then you have diverse perspectives? That was my first questions. And second one is, how can we bring this to the level of even elementary school and start teaching children so that we can make the future a better place for them?
mm.
So that's all. Those are the
Yeah,
things that I was wondering if, as I was listening
sure.
very attentively to what you're saying. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you. I appreciate your comments. Let me just mention kids and children, because I've actually written 4 children's books. And I'm a very big believer that it's really important for children to learn these skills. They're starting to learn them more, or they were starting to learn them more. I cannot say what's going to happen going forward in this country. I don't think many people can, but in terms of learning these skills, I think it's fundamental because the reason that we have a lot of problems and challenges is because people don't learn this. Um, and I think all of us who have been privy to um, learning about how to deal with conflict, I think we all have come to a conclusion that this can be done. It's not easy, but you have to have the knowledge um, and the experience to take a different road and to do that. So I think it's really important. And you know, it's interesting because um, I was always a proponent with my kids of letting them fail. It's not easy, but it's really important because I think kids learn a lot of lessons from their failures, from things that don't work out. Most of my kids, I have 3 daughters and they all played sports. And one of the things I loved about sports, it wasn't always easy, but when they didn't win, they had to figure out, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with the frustration of losing and things along those lines, or failure, right? So I think it's really important. And, you know, it's interesting because somebody asked me the other day, how would you help an organization when it comes to failure? And my answer was psychological safety. Like you have to make it, the best organizations um, understand that people in their organization are going to fail, and they don't point fingers. They basically say, let's really learn from this because we all know we're going to be at this point, at some point in our careers where things aren't going to go well, and things along those lines. So the best organizations that I've worked with, they really understand. They say, look, when failure happens, let's come together and figure out, why did this happen? What can we do about it? And how do we change as an organization so that we can grow and become better? Um, so I think, you know, a lot of it is your mindset and your attitude toward failure, and what that looks like. On your first question, um, of sort of how do you manage in a multiracial, multicultural, very diverse society? I mean, you know, I think we were doing sort of okay for a while. um, I don't think we're doing sort of okay anymore. And I'm having a hard time figuring out how we get back to a place. I can tell you, you know, for me growing up here in this country, all of the things that I thought were the foundational principles, the things that were really important to the story of America, have really fallen by the wayside in the last few years. You know, this notion of the importance of immigrants and that they built this country and things along those lines. So I don't really know the answer to the question of what do we do with this given the complexity of the world we're in. I wish I did, but I am struggling like many people to understand. You know, I always grew up learning that diversity was a wonderful thing and that people who came from different backgrounds and different perspectives. And I've had the chance to travel, and it's only been reinforced that cultures and ways of being and ways of operating the world that are different and unique are really fascinating, and uniformity is not. And so it was part of what I loved about this country. And I think the backlash against it is difficult, and it's hard to sort of figure out how we maintain the unique nature of this country with the kinds of things that are going on. I don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't, but it's the most honest thing I can tell you.
And for the uncertain times we are going through right now, Josh, I think what you just said is just so profound, because we really need to find a way of, like, you know, going back to what it was possible once over. right? And how to deal with the polarization we are experiencing, and all the kind of imposition of a particular way of life now. I mean, it's just kind of getting bad to worse, and the uncertainty, hubris, not
Mm.
knowing what that hubris looks like anymore and what might be next day. And I think that's the kind of like another type of uncertainty that we are experiencing right now. Because, you know, I think humanity, you know, when you look at it, I don't think there was any period of history that you could say, well, everything was certain during this time. Everything was just like, you know, according to plan. You know, uncertainty is probably a reality that
Mhm.
we need to accept. And probably that's the genesis of your book, isn't it? Like, you know, failure or uncertainty. And these are the realities of life, right?
Yeah.
What matters that how we deal with them, respond to them. And so I think with that, uh, thank you so much for really writing this book. It brings completely different understanding and appreciation of negotiation with those different dimensions. And, you know, especially for the students who are about to enter in this field. I think they need a book like this because it's going to give them so much more confidence, but also kind of like protection, and a kind of for them to sort of say, well, actually, I may be failing at some point, but it's okay. You know, this is just like the reality, the part of my job. So I don't know whether you have anything else to add as final thoughts, but after that, I will just wrap up.
I did. I see Richard had a quick question in the chat that maybe I could just answer, which is when there's an impasse, is there a way
Oh,
to,
sorry, I missed that.
it's okay, to leave the table that offers the best chance to return to the
Oh,
table? So yeah, there is. And I mean, you know, I had the pleasure of working with a guy named Roger Fisher many, many years ago, who was one of the co-authors of a book called Getting to Yes that some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, you should definitely read it. And I remember Roger, and this was a time well before cell phones and things like that in the mid 90s. And I remember him always saying that, you know, you shouldn't be afraid to walk away, but as he would say, don't be afraid to hang up the phone, but don't cut the line. So this is a days when, you know, phones were still hardwired. And what he meant was sometimes we have to walk away when it doesn't meet our interests or our needs. But he said, always make sure that the person has a way to get back in touch with you, or you have a way to get back in touch with them. And, you know, in the last chapter of the book, when I talk about getting back to the table, I say, you know, you need to knock on the door first. If you feel like there's a way back and that there could potentially be a different approach that you can imagine, and it's important to you to do that, don't wait for the other side to come. You have to do it because the other side, you know, people can be very stubborn and they can be very challenging, and they would rather not knock on the door and protect their ego than to come back to the table. And, you know, the analogy or the story that I use in the book is Nelson Mandela, right? Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison and he came out and he got in touch with Frederick de Klerk, and a journalist said to him, "Why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't you wait until de Klerk reached out to you?" And he said, "Because someone has to knock on the door first."
mm,
And you know, that's about ego. And we have to put our ego aside and say, whatever it is, whatever my objective is more important than my ego and things along those lines. So that would be, you know, and I always say to my kids, don't ever burn a bridge because you never know how it's going to come back to haunt you. And so I always believe that even in the most difficult negotiations, I always end by saying, sorry, this didn't work out. You've got my information. I've got yours. I hope that we can, you know, we can get back to this
mm.
if either one of us can see a different way forward. So I think you always want to leave it on a good note, whether it's, you know, usually it doesn't end that way, but you have that ability and that gives you the ability to come back around.
Wonderful. And I think that's a really good place to end the
Yeah.
conversation. Josh, thanks so much. Well,
Thank
once
you.
again, congratulations
Thank you.
for the book, and it's a really great work. And those who haven't bought a copy and read it yet, I really recommend that you do so. I think it's going to be a wonderful piece that you will be going back to, you know, several times, and it'll be part of your practice of negotiation and mediation work. There's so much insight and in a very accessible way in this book. So with that, Josh, thanks so much
Thank you.
for being with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll launch another book not too far in distant future, so that, you know, we're expecting another book coming up soon, Josh.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Take good care.